Hello, and welcome to the Stable Reports podcast. Stable Report is a news site dedicated to curating the best resources related to stablecoin projects. We celebrate the development of stablecoins and see them as a stepping stone to mainstream adoption of cryptocurrencies for daily use in transactions. If you'd like to get acquainted with what stablecoins are, visit our website or follow us on Twitter at Stable Report, and let us know what you think. As always, if you see we're missing something, please contact us. For this week's podcast, we have the honor of interviewing Preston Byrne. Preston is a banking and Hi, Preston.
Howdy.
Preston is a banking and securities lawyer in London, specialising in securitisation and derivatives. He advises the Adam Smith Institute on legal aspects of its policy proposals and writes on a range of subjects, including housing and planning law, the security state, freedom of expression, and, of course, cryptocurrency. He's also a founder and former COO of Monax, makers of the first open-source permissioned blockchain client way back in 2014, now known as Hyperledger Burrow, one of the Hyperledger projects hosted by the Linux Foundation. Preston has written critically about stablecoin projects and is an outspoken and often quoted critic of the current state in cryptocurrency, which we really need. Also, he loves marmots, and actually, that's how we got in touch the first time that we had an interview, through a marmot meme. But that recording didn't go so well, so he was a very gracious marmot in allowing us a second interview. Thank you, Preston.
Anytime, my pleasure.
Our first question in Stable Report is always, what got you interested in cryptocurrencies? So what's your story?
So it kind of started with Dogecoin, I've got to admit. So I was doing this thing when I was a young lawyer. I was trying to hop from topic to topic. So every year I'd have one thing that I'd write about or research. And so in 2013, I finished housing. I was doing housing and planning that year. And then I said, what do I do next? And this thing, Bitcoin, was like, well, that looks interesting. So a friend of mine who's working at a think tank in Guatemala, down at UFM, had this idea for basically a version of Bitcoin that was designed as a municipal accounting system. He called it MuniBit. And that got me thinking, what if you could take something like Bitcoin and you could use it as a very fraud-resistant or tamper-resistant enterprise database? And so that's what eventually became what is now Hyperledger Burrow, which was a fork of the Ethereum virtual machine, but with permissioning involved, so that you could get all of the cryptographic certainty of your hashing and your and of your digital signatures bundled into a neat little package that you could run in a bunch of different places at once. Dogecoin was when the penny dropped as to how to do it. I was like, okay, this is how you do it. But the idea was in that initial proposal that my friend Zachary Caceres came up with called MuniBit. So that's how I got started.
Fascinating. So it kind of started with a joke, but then it became really serious.
Yeah, as with all the best things in life, right?
Yes. Let's get something out of the way. Do you believe any stablecoin projects at all could work?
No. I think a stablecoin could work as long as it is convertible, right? So if you have a token of some kind which is backed by an asset somewhere, which is held on trust for the holder of the token, then what you have is the holder of the token effectively owns the asset which is sitting in the vault, and what the token represents is something which is a coupon, basically, which entitles them to go and proceed to the place where the physical thing is being held and claim that thing back. So that is really the way to do it if you're going to do it. The downsides from that standpoint is that you have to be 100% cash collateralized or 100% asset collateralized at all times, which isn't necessarily the most efficient way to record a dollar balance. This is why we do fractional reserve banking. So what we see with the stablecoins is slightly different. And chiefly we're seeing people with large crypto balances trying to use the crypto markets as a way to store value, which is somehow related to those underlying crypto balances. And generally speaking, there are three ways you can do this. The first one is more or less equal to the asset backed. So that's something like a tether, right? So tether, forget all the criticism for a moment and all of the FUD and all the rest of that that's going on in the market. If everything that the people who run Tether are saying is true and there's no regulatory problem with it, then Tether has dollars sitting in a bank account, which ostensibly you should be able to go and redeem with the Tether token, right? So that's not really a stable coin. That's more a coupon for an asset which exists. The stable coins then are these kind of two little types of projects. The first is the MakerDAO style stablecoin, which I would call I would call it the collateralized stablecoin. And the second would be the algorithmic stablecoin. So that's the basis style stablecoin. The collateralized ones, basically what you do is you make a margin long bet, locking up some ether into a contract from which you get another dollar of exposure, which you can go spend. So if you want, you could potentially go buy more ether with that. So it's a way to bet on price movement in ether, basically. And the idea is that if the price of ether deteriorates, you've locked up enough in the contract, that the smart contract, which constitutes the stablecoin itself, you've locked up enough collateral that you can basically call that contract and say, okay, well, the collateral is deteriorated, so we're not going to spend the $1 to whoever holds this stablecoin now, so that they can go and get their money back. So that's one way to do it. So you multiple collateralize the stablecoin, 2, 3, 400%. The issues with that, of course, are that it's very value destructive in an environment where the price of the underlying crypto token is falling. So if the value is going up, everybody wins in the transaction. The person who holds the coin can spend it. It's always worth $1. They can go redeem it for $1 when they close it out. But what they're not. But on the way down, by contrast, what happens is you're burning through the collateral. However many times it's collateralized, that many times faster. So if you have 400. Or if you have 400% of the collateral, as the price of ether falls, you're losing 4 times as much money as the price of ether deteriorates. So that's the risk with that approach, and so that's the MakerDAO style. Then we have the algorithmic style, which is your basis coin style scheme, and there they think that they can set up incentive arrangements where you can try to incentivize people to spend money in the system in order to keep the price at or near, let's say, $1. For sake of argument, for the coin. It's an interesting idea, but ultimately that kind of concept relies on the stablecoin being a closed system, which nothing in economics is. Everything has to go interact with something outside. The motivations of the actors are not solely locked into the stablecoin. So if you have someone, for example, who has, I don't know, let's say they've got a margin long position on Bitfinex and they go get liquidated. And they need to figure out that, I can't pay my rent this month. I need to go and get some money from somewhere else. Under those circumstances, someone who holds a stablecoin might be perfectly ready, willing, and able to part with that stablecoin for less than what they paid for it and take the loss, as long as they could get cash in a certain amount, which they could go then meet some other liabilities. Now, this is not something that you would usually see when the market is moving upward. That's not the sort of thing that happens. When a market, however, is moving downward very rapidly, as it did in 2008, when people are beginning to wonder, they're beginning to call in their debts, you can have a cascade effect where people are constantly trying to get out of everything at once. And that's not necessarily a bubble being drawn down as we're seeing this week in the crypto markets. That's something where you have a systemic fear of people not being able to meet their obligations. And so what they're doing is a flight to liquidity and safety wherever there is. So in an event like that, you would have, ultimately, you say, well, what does this do for the stablecoin? This means that people aren't buying the stablecoin. And if people aren't buying something like Basis, then there's no way that Basis can hold its value, because it needs that essential component of the purchaser in order for the system to work. So my criticisms of these schemes, generally speaking, are that you have a bunch of really bright guys, and I'll wrap this up. You have bright young guys coming from places like Princeton and Stanford and Google or wherever they come from. And they don't have a lot of practical experience with the finance, and they're all under the age of 30, so they weren't around last time the big financial crisis happened. So these lessons are going to need to be learned the hard way as they develop these systems. What could these things be useful for? I think with some modifications, you could have some really interesting trading applications. You could do some really interesting derivatives automation with the things that people are developing now. But I don't think you can make a stablecoin out of it because the economics don't make sense.
It's interesting. I think a big problem in this space is that most people going into it, either they are very well versed in technology and not in finance, or the other way around. What's interesting about Basis in particular, in my opinion, is that one of their advisors was one of the engineers with Soros against the British pound. So I wonder what his motives were for that. I can't remember his name right now.
It's another project. What is it? A stablecoin project called Saga,
Yes,
which is sort of an, if memory serves, it's mostly a collateralized stablecoin. But that got Myron Scholes on board, of Black Scholes fame. So there's something in it that's getting people really interested in programmatic money and particular automatic.
It's Stanley Druckenmiller.
Stanley Druckenmiller. Okay, yeah, he's one of the investors, Druckenmiller. But so there's something which is pushing these guys' buttons. They're looking at it and saying, "Hold on a second." People often said at Bitcoin, right? They'd go, "Bitcoin is its own Federal Reserve because it has its own money supply. That's its own money supply algorithm, which determines how many Bitcoins are produced." Well, that's not quite what the Fed does, because the Fed is actually responsive to changing market conditions. And so what's happened is they've kind of added another layer of complexity, and they've said, in order to ensure that the purchasing power of this coin stays close to $1, we're going to introduce some added complexity. I can foresee in the future a system like this being used to kind of be a better vehicle for the market to communicate information to regulators. But I don't necessarily see a stablecoin as being the logical outcome of that development.
What about combining all of the stablecoins into a system of whitelisting the most stable projects, and creating a mechanism that if one of the stablecoin fails, then there are certain risk takers that would take on that loss? Would something like that work?
I think there you're really looking at, you're looking to get stability by basically having people enter into default contracts of sorts, default swaps. So if the stablecoin goes down, I have a counterparty over here who's willing to satisfy the loss and ensure that everybody who invested in the stablecoin is made whole. That's a pretty significant risk. I wonder how you would price that risk and how you would get someone to take the other end of that trade, unless they were really doing it for charitable purposes. Because so far we've seen a lot of stablecoin failure. Nubits failed. That's one example of a stablecoin that failed. MakerDAO, when a bot went offline in January, failed and lost 40% of its value because it was very thinly traded on buy box. So in the absence of knowing how these things are going to perform, and in particular when you don't have something that's asset backed, where you could at least have some recourse to some assets, if it's just a question of people don't use the system, are you going to allow everybody to kind of rack up a huge balance that you're going to guarantee unless you're paid an enormous amount of money to do it? I query whether that's going to happen.
So you mentioned stable coins that have collateral as serving as a coupon in a way. As I'm sure you're aware, the Venezuelan government is planning to peg their devalued, hyperinflated currency to this stable coin of sorts called the petro, which is collateralized by thousands of petroleum barrels underground. Now, of course, I do not believe in the petro. There's been no movement in it, and it's been banned by the United States.
Yeah.
But theoretically, and envisioning a future, how could this potentially work? Could a country achieve stability that way by decoupling from the dollar?
The petro strikes me as a way for the Venezuelan government to try to get its paws on some Bitcoin and other assets that it can sell for cash, particularly US dollars, which it desperately needs because its own national currency is so worthless. So the way that the petro works is that it will allow, you can buy petro tokens from the Venezuelan government. Those petro tokens are denominated in the price in bolivars of, so basically it's an entitlement to the equivalent amount in bolivars of what a barrel of oil would cost at the date of issuance, right? So you're basically saying, it's an IOU where they say, we have a barrel of oil, it's worth 100 bolivars, let's say. I know it's obviously much more than that. But we have a barrel of oil, it's worth 100 bolivars. And if you buy this barrel of oil for 100 bolivars worth of dollars today, we will give you back 100 bolivars tomorrow or next week or in a year. And so it's a cash settlement, but the 100 bolivars is backed by the barrel of oil. So it should obviously stabilize the currency. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me because basically they're two different things. The barrel of oil in the ground is an asset which you could sell if you wanted for cash. or you could sell a futures contract denominated in something. And then the bolivar is a different type of asset. And basically they're saying if you pay in cash, Bitcoin now, we will give you back bolivars later, price at the price now, which means the bolivars will be worth much less later. So in effect, it's not a very good deal for anyone who wants to invest.
Right.
Apart from the fact that if you're a U.S. person and you do that, you're going to find yourself in legal trouble. So that really doesn't strike me as a particularly good idea. Now, does that mean that you couldn't have some type of government asset which is tokenized in the future, which could raise municipal funds or be used as evidence of municipal debt or something like that? Absolutely not. You could certainly have that, and you could certainly make those processes more efficient using blockchain tech. But the way Venezuela is doing it is basically to try to dupe people to give the government cash so that it can meet its short-term obligations, and they're not getting a whole lot back in return. So I don't see that as really a good basis for a stable coin as such, because it's not a good basis for a stable coin because it relies on a fundamentally unstable currency, and it's designed to sort of advance funds on the basis of this rapidly devaluing currency. So what they're doing is not smart.
It's been over 40 years that the gold window was closed by Nixon. Theoretically, could that be a possibility to restart the economy where it's actually sort of like going back to the gold standard and everything would be transparent, and each unit of this petro or gold coin is backed by an ounce or whatever amount of gold? Could that be a way to have independence from the volatility of having the currency pegged to the dollar?
I think Venezuela's issue now really isn't one that gets solved with a stable coin. It's one that gets solved with the medium of exchange that people are legally required to use and pay taxes in. It starts bearing some rational relationship to economic activity instead of the government's printing press. I mean, that's what needs to happen. Is it needs economic shock therapy. You need to get the government out of the industries that it's overtaken. You need to basically stop the government from making economic decisions on people's behalf. You need to get the state oil company, PDVSA, you need to get that back up and running, or PDVSA, you need to get that back up and running as soon as possible so that can be a source of revenue for the government. I mean, what's basically happened is the government has pushed out all private enterprise, and so of course the country is falling apart. But I don't think going in and saying, well, now we have gold and we have a currency that's backed by gold and we're going to start issuing it to everybody makes a whole lot of sense. You have to really, from the ground up, do a lot of reform and get the government out of spending other people's money or devaluing people's money in order to meet its own short-term spending objectives. I mean, that's why this is happening, because they're printing money in order to feed and pay their soldiers. Right, but they're not printing it to everybody. They're just printing it and giving it to people who are in close with the government, right? And that's not a sustainable long-term solution.
We're in agreement on that. Do you envision, or have you had previous conversations envisioning countries with a decentralized bank where they don't have control over the printing press?
So we've seen that before, and specifically we saw that in Britain in the late 1700s. The issue with that was that the credit crisis of 1772 was the big one. And basically banks were issuing their own notes, and then they were endorsing them and endorsing them and endorsing them on the basis of, and they lost track of how they were endorsing them, or they were drawing two notes on the same deposit, or whatever you might imagine. So there was a crisis in confidence because you couldn't be certain of whether a note that you held, which said, this is £5 held at Bank X. You couldn't be certain whether that was actually there. A blockchain kind of changes that because you can be certain if a note, which is recorded on a blockchain, which you hold, is recorded at the bank, because you can go and look at the entire history of everything at the bank. Would you then want to say, well, we're moving our printing presses over to that and we're going to start using blockchains as digital cash? I don't think you'd want to do that until such time as you had significant advances in scalability and or significant advances in storage capacity or network capacity to make that feasible. Because as things stand right now, a centralized system is much more efficient for most transactions, like Visa, MasterCard. And if you were stuffing 50 to 100,000 transactions a second onto a blockchain, you'd have a system which is unusable very, very quickly. So that I think is one way of looking at it. If you said, well, let's do it with corporate debt or something like that, that might make more sense. But again, this is something which is in the future, not the immediate future, but the sort of medium term, 5 to 10 year time horizon.
Which brings me back to one of your main motivations to be such a prolific writer. I think it's how greed took over the space, how everything is fairy dust and a lot of marketing buzzwords. Other than telling our listeners and our readers to do their own research, what are some pieces of content or literature that have helped you to frame the space, or that you would recommend others to read up on?
You know, there's not a lot of good literature out there. There is a lot of bad writing. To be honest with you, the thing to do that I would recommend, I'm naturally quite skeptical, would be to follow the other skeptics on Twitter. So that's Isabella Kaminska, David Gerard, Tim Swanson, yours truly, and then some of the Bitcoin maximalists, so Bitstein, Pierre Rochard, and a couple of others. And the sober voices in each of those communities, these are not people who are sitting there, except Pierre, kind of a little bit about Bitcoin, but generally speaking, quite level-headed. These are voices who are not trying to sell anything to you. And so as a consequence, that's what they really need to be aware of. Be aware of someone who's trying to sell something to you. There are books, every book that's been written on blockchain, generally speaking, if you dust off the cover and you ask who wrote it, why did they write it, and who do they work for, and what are their interests, there's always a sale somewhere in there. So to look for that. Look out to see when someone's trying to sell you on a dream or a vision, or if they're trying to sell you a coin or a product, that's when alarm bells, red flags like crazy should be going off. Because the people who are shooting straight with you, they'll be independent, they won't have an agenda, and they're not going to try to get your money. And then kind of take it from there.
So you also agree that even Bitcoin is not the proper solution to our problems today. Like perhaps Bitcoin will not be here in the long term, given the problems it has today.
I think Bitcoin is here to stay.
Okay.
I think Bitcoin's here to stay. Do I think that Bitcoin is going to be the basis of a global financial system? Mm-hmm. No. Do I think that Bitcoin is going to replace cash? No. Do I think that people are going to denominate debt in Bitcoin? No. Do I think that before any of those things could happen, you're going to need to see substantial regulatory supervision of places like the exchanges? Mm-hmm. Yes. Bitcoin's here to stay. There are a lot of improvements that need to be made. I think one thing to look out for in particular are the layer 2 type solutions such as Lightning that are going to add capacity to it. But the market itself the tech is brilliant, right? It's had hundreds of thousands, if not millions of man hours directed at Bitcoin itself, the software and that particular network to ensure that particular network works. And as a result, it's a very robust software system. So that's really, that works in Bitcoin's favor as compared to other projects which may only have a few thousand or tens of thousands of hours put into them. But we're not in a place yet where we can be sure that we can tell someone, hey, if you buy Bitcoin now, or if you take out a margin long position on fill in the blank exchange, someone's not going to just wash trade and wipe you out. That level of confidence is not something people should have.
So what will it take to achieve mainstream adoption of cryptocurrencies if stablecoins are not the answer and Bitcoin may not be the answer long term with enough capital and liquidity to achieve stability? Then what is necessary, in your opinion, to achieve mainstream adoption of cryptocurrencies?
What's necessary for mainstream adoption of cryptocurrencies is the same as what's necessary for anything else using a blockchain. You need to have people who are familiar with the idea of using a distributed peer-to-peer network, one. Two, so it's a distributed peer-to-peer network, and two, key management, right? So if you can get those two things in one package, and you can get people used to using tools and applications and keys, then you have the necessary preconditions, not only to adopt cryptocurrency, but also to adopt other types of automated financial assets, bonds, shares, whatever else you like, anything you can think of, fractional ownership in a self-driving car, it doesn't matter what it is. once you have that infrastructure built and the ability for people to know this is the standard, this is how I use it, this is how I log in, I've been doing this for a couple of years, then it's not just cryptocurrencies which are in play, it's everything which is in play. So that's what you need for mass adoption, is you need people to be used to it, and you need to have them have sufficient avenues to access these things and sufficient products that they're able to find things that they want to consume and invest in. So I think it's just time is the answer to that.
How much time do you think?
4 years ago, I remember 4 years ago, I had just started a company. There were maybe 5 other companies that were blockchain companies and not Bitcoin companies in existence. And then 6 months later, so that's 3.5 years ago, we released permission blockchain, right? And everyone, it was a scandal what had happened. Krista Rose and Junseth, for those of us who know them from Twitter, would say, "Oh, this is ridiculous, a blockchain without coins, you don't need that." Now, 3.5 years later, Venezuela has its own blockchain, right? What?
Right.
So the speed has been just unbelievable. But a lot of that has been experimentation. I think that the installation is going to come 2-3 years, probably max. It might happen more quickly than that. Who the hell knows? In some respects, this has been adopted very, very quickly, and we've seen people go on to. I have friends who come up to me here in the small town where I live, and oh yeah, I invested in Tron, and I was like, I haven't invested in Tron. I don't buy this stuff, and I work in this every day, and you're telling me about your altcoin portfolio, and I haven't even bothered looking at it. So there's something going on where people are getting used to the tooling. Whether I don't think it's going to be the invest in altcoin model forever, and I think that stablecoins, to be honest with you, are just kind of a temporary solution while the mainstream financial system figures out how it's going to on-ramp dollars into these systems. So we'll see.
Absolutely agree. And on that topic, Preston, thank you very much for your time. It's been really an enlightening conversation. And I recommend everybody to follow Preston's writings on law, politics, distributed systems, and marmots. So check out his blog at PrestonByrne.com. That's Preston, BYRNE.com. Or follow him on Twitter at PrestonJByrne. Thank you very much.
Anytime.